Good. Right. So sometimes I wonder if you think that doctors actually should have magical powers, that we can see all sorts of things, and that you worry about that, you non-doctors, and you're so worried about it that you really feel you've just got to knock us down completely off our pedestals and back in the gutter where we belong. One of the things that I see over and over in decisions, medical legal reports cannot tell who or why or where the torture occurred, and therefore they can tell us nothing about torture at all. It's like saying, if I'm looking over here, I don't know what's behind me. Well, I'm not looking behind me, so how can I know? But I think there's a bit more to it than that. I'm going to unpack it further through the course of this talk. But it's interesting that it was already been raised in the earlier session. Does the absence of an opposite medical expert in asylum cases lead the decision maker to form their own clinical judgment? And this is something that I do worry about, and whether that is one of the reasons why the bar keeps rising for medical evidence. Well, we've already established asylum law requires a very low standard of proof, and that's enshrined paragraph 92 of the Istanbul Protocol. There's an even lower standard of proof, which is also currently a very hot issue for us, and that's for torture survivors rooted into immigration detention. They don't even have to have the level of proof required for an asylum decision, just a concern. And yet the numbers keep increasing, despite the UN Committee Against Torture Fifth Report 2013 saying that this barrier should be lowered for torture survivors. That's, I'm sorry to say, not evident in the new template that's currently circulating for Rule 35 reports. So this goes wider than just asylum decisions. Myths and legends. We already heard about some case law. I'm going to look at some other case law which I see frequently cited in asylum decisions, which is frankly outdated and often clinically just wrong. But I'm going to talk first more about the principles of the Istanbul Protocol, how they become subverted by the clinical judgments of non-clinicians. And I'm going to do that looking at some research that we've done at Freedom from Torture. First, though, just a brief note about body of evidence. This was the report we produced in 2011. And it demonstrated, by looking at decisions mainly in the tribunal, that medical evidence was being assessed inconsistently, not just by judges, but also by the Home Office, and that this was having very significant consequences with critical failures of protection and right to rehabilitation. As a result, what do we get out of that? Well, we got a spot at the first tier tribunal training for immigration judges. And over the last 3 years, I've trained, I think, every single one, I hope, or almost all of them. And that training session has included myth-busting, the idea that doctors believe everything they're told. I'm sorry, we don't. We also discussed who can make psychiatric diagnoses. You don't have to be a consultant psychiatrist, and they've all been trained on that. And we looked at the effects of trauma on memory. So all the first-tier tribunal judges have had that in their training. We also, with Helen Bamber Foundation, worked on a new asylum policy instruction for reports from the two foundations. I've highlighted just some of those key points that are laid out in this asylum policy instruction on how to assess this medical evidence, that the foundations have recognised expertise, their clinicians are objective, it's not just a report about credibility. Case owners must not make clinical judgments, they must remember that low standard of proof, and they should not dismiss or give little weight to the claim of torture with the Medical Foundation or Helen Bamber Foundation report. But what we're seeing, unfortunately, is the reports are still being challenged by decision makers. The Istanbul Protocol standards are repeatedly questioned, and in particular, paragraph 105F, where we consider the possibility of fabrication, which, as I said, is part of 101 basic medical education. We don't believe how much you say you smoke, we don't believe how much you say you drink, and we certainly don't believe that you got that infection from sitting on a toilet seat. So I don't know if it's just projection that you want doctors to believe everything you tell us, but sorry guys, we don't. So let's come on to these self-infliction by proxy allegations and deal with those specifically. In fact, the allegations predate the KV case law by a number of years. And in fact, the prevalence was increasing in cases we were seeing at Freedom from Torture before KV, and I decided to audit the heated metal object burns cases that we were seeing. There was also that infamous letter from the British High Commission in Colombo. But over years, we've seen a number of references to indecisions about self-infliction by proxy, the torture factory, the scar factory. Is it in Joseph Camp? Is it in Moscow or the Balkans, East London, Croydon? Where is it?
Bromley.
Oh, is it Bromley now? It's been in Handsworth too. It moves around. It's obviously like a bus somehow. They drive it around. That's the text of that famous letter that many Sri Lankans who claimed asylum abroad inflicted wounds on themselves. And versions of this allegation we've seen occurring in multiple asylum decisions made by both UKBA, as it then was, and immigration judges, saying that they knew that determined asylum seekers may arrange for scars to be inflicted. They do not lightly reach the conclusion, but they come firmly to it, and they feel that people are set out to provide this evidence. So what did I do? I looked at 2010 and 11 cases initially. That's where the report was written in those years, because I think that it's more helpful to look at a whole group. If you're questioning something, it's clearly not just happening one time to one person. It's a practice, it's a business. Somebody's making a lot of money doing this. So let's look at a whole group and see what we can identify. And as the Istanbul Protocol tells us, let's make an overall assessment and not just go on a single lesion. So let's think about whether there might be evidence of collusion and what that might look like. Would there be a different profile in the victims? I think we need to be honest. The idea of secondary gain has to be considered. If you're leaving an area of poverty and conflict, possibly gaining access to jobs, education, healthcare, how far would you go? Would you go this far? Fabrication allegation really suggests to me insider knowledge. Now, there is case law about returning Tamils being at risk if they have scars that could be readily seen at a checkpoint indicating previous combat experience. So putting myself in the head of the businessman who wants to make money from this, I think I'll put the scars somewhere where the person couldn't have caused them themselves, make them really big so no one would believe that anyone would consent to pain and disfigurement, and that'll get people asylum. But there were no precedents for this. Combat scarring doesn't look like that. There is no minimum number of scars that automatically wins you asylum. And we know that asylum is often denied to torture victims if it's deemed they're at no future risk. You can be dying of HIV, cancer, renal failure, you still don't get asylum. So where would you get this idea that this would be helpful? So taking a more rational approach and looking at these cases, in those 2 years we had 106 medical reports and 31 of them documented burns from heated metal objects. I looked also at the previous research. When you want to ask a research question, you first of all think about what's already known. So we know that heated metal object burns have been going on in Sri Lanka for a long time. Freedom from Torture, when it was Medical Foundation, were looking at this in the 1990s. IRCT 2004, 2007, 9% rate. I also looked at other countries that we are recording this information in and found that it was occurring in Uganda and in Iran, for example, but in small numbers still. Suddenly we get this big increase. So we want to think about possible collusion. Do they all come from the same solicitor? I didn't say that. Do they come from the same town, the same job? Were they all in the same camp? Are they all giving the same story? Then I looked at the background. What characteristics in forensic medicine do we know about fabricated injuries? Well, we know that they tend to be very superficial, scratches and abrasions. On parts of the body you can access readily yourself. They often tend to look the same. And the account of the events doesn't fit the clinical findings. I also audited cases from Freedom from Torture where we thought that the injuries that somebody was saying were torture didn't match the history. So, for example, traditional medicine scars, little ritual cuts with a razor blade being attributed to torture, or a little bit of pigmentation on the knees being attributed to torture. These are the sorts of things that we were finding in cases where the doctor did not believe the person. And in contrast to that, we have the characteristics of torture injuries, varying depths and severity, different injury types, different modes of causation, no sparing of clothed body parts because the victims are often partly or fully naked. And we look also at congruence between the account given, the clinical findings, and the timeline. So these are the sort of factors that I found in reviewing that group of Sri Lankan cases. They tended to have a complex torture history. 41% had been detained more than once. There was good clinical congruence, and there were a number of scars that they pointed out as not due to torture, which we take as an indication that they're not exaggerating, they're not seeking to put every scar on their whole body as down to torture. We also found that they tended to have a lot of other scars due to torture that were not burns. A lot have been sexually assaulted, and there's a big psychological impact of the torture, with a high number of people with post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and a lot of them already independently in treatment because they're so unwell mentally. So you can build a sort of typical case profile. Now, this is not to be used as a checklist. It doesn't mean that a genuine person can tick every box on this line, and it doesn't mean that if you can't tick every box, you're not a torture survivor. One of the dangers of producing a profile like this is that people will abuse it in that sort of way, but it's an indication of how to assess things. And what I did also was to cross-check. So if one of the factors wasn't in a particular case, well, how many of the others were? And it tended to be many. So if they did come from the same solicitor, the burn pattern and the torture history would be really different, or the detention centre might be the same, but other things would be different. I also wondered why heated metal object burns when, if I was going to fabricate torture, cigarettes are so much more available, so easy to use. Still painful, still look like torture. We weren't seeing the same questions raised so frequently about people who had torture burns from cigarettes. It's a really odd, upside down sort of idea about the evidence. So looking at KV, I think it just asked the wrong damn question. Can the analysis of a single scar tell us by who or why it was inflicted? Well, no, it can't. But analysis of all the clinical evidence of an individual can tell us a lot more than one lesion in isolation. An analysis of a group of cases can tell us more still. And again, we come back to the good old Istanbul Protocol, which already told us that that's what you're meant to do. So in summary, I found no one single factor which could identify a true victim from a fabricator, but I did feel that you can make a balanced assessment of all the evidence and make a reasonable likelihood assessment about your conclusion. But focusing on the single factor to the exclusion of other evidence tends to distort decision-making. This issue of lack of congruence is a really important one because it is about the expertise and experience of the examiner as much as anything else. So if the patient says they beat me with iron rods, and when you look at them you find burns, and the burns seem to be curved, it makes you think, oh, this doesn't add up. Does that mean they're automatically fabricating? That's a possibility. There are other possibilities. So think about the contact time required to cause a burn, the pliability of heated metal. How do people make stuff with iron? They heat it so they can bend it. And you listen to the patient. Human skin is not cowhide. You don't need to do it like this. And burns are not potato prints. This is not how it happens. How long does it take metal to cause a burn that will blister? Well, fantastically, as they used to do in the 1950s, they studied this. They got a bunch of rats. This was in a good cause, I have to tell you, so don't worry too much about the poor little rats. It was to improve safety standards in metalwork industries. A bunch of rats, and they burned their ears. And they measured the temperature of the implement used to burn little ratty ears with the time taken to cause a blister. Not very long at all. So if the metal is glowing red, is it 70 degrees? No, it's 480 degrees. How hot could you get your poker if you put it in the fire? You can get it really, really hot. So I don't have the figures because they didn't do this with the rat ears. I think the rat ear would have just melted away completely. But you can just see that I'm sure someone somewhere will be able to produce a graph which shows you the infinitesimal contact time required to blister human skin. I'm now going to move on to more recent research that I've looked at, freedom from torture, and this is an audit of response letters that we've been asked to do, and I wanted to focus initially, because there were unfortunately quite a lot, I thought I would look at those where the UKVI decision was made after January 14, when the new API came in, supposedly setting these wonderful new standards by which they would make their decisions. So I got a group of 24 cases where the decision is made in 2014. I wrote a response letter and I know what happened to it. So of these, 12 got asylum following the response letter and 12 were refused. Slightly more of them were pre-initial decision, 10 were fresh claim. And you can see that it looks as though things are pretty bad for you if you're fresh claim. Now, these fresh claims usually have had no medical evidence beforehand, but they've clearly got a very weighty loss of credibility. in their file. And this seems to be making it very difficult for medical evidence, even if it's the first time it's been heard, to actually turn things around. It also looks from this admittedly very small sample as though Liverpool's not the place to get your decision made, but maybe we'll need to talk to the Home Office about that. And I looked at the different factors in these decisions against those standards set out in the API. So, for example, both foundations are accepted as having recognised expertise. 30% of these decisions made negative comment about the doctor's qualifications. They all made a lot of negative comments about the methodology of the medical legal report or the interpretation of the findings. Very common was taking issue with the consideration of other causes of the physical lesions, with the assessment of consistency, and the objectivity of the doctor being very frequently questioned. They all made multiple clinical judgments, and this is despite the API very specifically saying, don't do this, not your thing. They do it. And one of the commonest ones that they do is they challenge the clinical assessment that's been made of the link between the psychological evidence and the torture, and they prefer other causes of the physical and psychological injuries. They also take issue with multiple other things, as you can read there, with late disclosure, with why you're not in treatment. If you're not in treatment, you can't have this illness, and so on. And there's a lot of errors basically in law. I don't want to go too far on this because obviously I'm not a lawyer, but seems to me pretty blindingly obvious. They fail to give appropriate level of weight to the medical evidence. They continue to apply negative credibility findings to dismiss the medical evidence. And they fail to consider the physical with the psychological evidence in relation to the torture account. So what we see in these UKVI decisions is they go through the history of the detention, they look at the medical evidence about physical lesions, they knock that down, and then they say, therefore, we don't believe you were detained. Then they go on, blah, 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 blah. They finally come to, can we risk returning you? What about your mental health? And then they bring in the psychological evidence, but they don't include that psychological evidence that is also actually going to the weight of evidence corroborating the torture account. And this is a really important failing. I also want to talk about case law very briefly if I've got time, so I'm going to move on. But basically, in summary, these 2014 decisions that have been returned to us for responses show repeated and multiple breaches of the API, especially the use of clinical judgments and a failure to give appropriate weight to the report. But they also frequently cite outdated and wrong case law. And as we've already heard, there's some good case law out there which tells them how to do it. But instead, I'm sure you've all seen this a million times, HH. What does this say? It confuses the credibility assessment with the doctor's obligation to assess fabrication and accuses the doctor of trespassing on this. And it confuses the use of consistent in its non-IP sense and suggests that there's no higher level of corroboration of the account than this, which seems to ignore completely that paragraph 187 exists and that the doctor has almost certainly given it some attention in their report. There's another problem with HH, again, a very popular paragraph to copy and paste into your decision if you're a little UKVI person, and they go on about the doctor's not a psychiatrist. But we've already established in the API that reports from the foundations have their own recognised expertise. We've also established in the first-tier tribunal training that you don't have to be a consultant psychiatrist to make a psychiatric diagnosis or give that opinion. There's also, again, a repetition of this idea that it's just a repeat of the account given. And again, HE is also trotted out to say that doctors just repeat everything they're told. And as I've said to you, well, this is not what we do. And the FTT, the first tier tribunal training, has reiterated this, and the API says that these reports have expertise which needs to be recognised as independent. Sadly, the upper tier message hasn't quite got through. The James Jones decision, which came out in July, August this year, refers to a requirement for specialist training for physical evidence of scarring. Sorry, that's a typo. That doesn't exist, and it seeks to discard the psychological evidence given by a doctor who's not a consultant psychiatrist. Very briefly, AEFE, again, constantly copied and pasted into decisions, and it says this bizarre clinical judgment, really, in the case law that conflates post-traumatic stress disorder with depression. they're not the same thing. And just because something's become more common doesn't automatically mean that it's a fabricated condition. It might just mean it's become more common, or we're recognizing it more clearly and identifying it more often. WT, another one that gets copied and pasted in. Again, this ignores the fact that the medical legal report should be regarded as expert evidence. It disregards the IP meaning of consistent with and the expert assessment of levels of consistency. And it disregards the assessment of relative likelihood that report writers are now making according to good forensic practice and RT. It suggests a higher level of consistency is required to substantiate evidence of torture, which is raising the standard of proof and ignoring, if you like, paragraph 161 of the Istanbul Protocol, which reminds us that many forms of torture leave no scars at all. Worst of all, PE Yugoslavia. I don't know anybody who knows this case. I couldn't track this down. This is the paragraph, the first bullet point, which is pasted in and said to be PE Yugoslavia. The report is not proof of when or by whom the injuries may have been sustained or why they were caused. PE Yugoslavia is a psychiatric case about PTSD and risk of suicide on return. There is no physical evidence in this case. Why are they doing this? They're just putting it in from somewhere and calling it case law when it isn't even case law. And there are a number of other things. Again, I've just pasted these in. They're in multiple decisions, and they, again, are contrary to the API that the Home Office have signed up to. Reports are expert and independent. You can't say that they're not. The wrong standard of proof is used. The diagnostic level of evidence is not required at this stage. Some of these sentences, I tried to track them back using good old Google and everything else I could find. I found some of them are quoted in Asylum Aid's fantastic publication, Still No Reason at All and No Reason at All. So they go back into the mid-90s, but still no case law, still being copied and pasted in, and yet they have no basis in these decision-making. So these are the sort of abuses of our medical evidence, this by whom, where, or why, the use of case law to argue that medical evidence has failed to do something and can therefore be discarded, even though that's in any event outside its scope. We can't tell you what colour uniform the guard was wearing, or the name of the prison, or the particular motivation of the torturer when we're examining an individual for evidence of torture. But what we can give you is an overall evaluation of physical and psychological evidence in the context of what is known of other possible causes of such a clinical picture, and give that expert opinion on the likelihood that torture occurred. Second abuse of medical evidence, 187 and RT. I just don't think the case owners understand this at all. They use it to argue that other causes can be preferred, even when the report clearly assesses relative likelihood. Even though the burden of proof is so low that consistent with is still evidence of torture, they're saying that it's not, and they overrule the doctor's opinion. The third one, fabrication, using the doctor's very specific consideration of paragraph 105 on fabrication to dismiss the medical evidence as a whole on the grounds the doctor has considered overall credibility, and therefore they've gone outside their boundaries and we can throw the whole thing in the bin. Still seeing this abuse that we're not a proper expert, there are incorrect assertions about medical qualifications, training and expertise. Doctors believe everything they're told. Well, I think I've made that point clearly enough, but this loss of credibility elsewhere is used to deny the medical evidence and to accuse the doctor of not being objective and believing things without question. There's a lot of confusion about this consistent in the IP 187 sense and consistent in its dictionary sense. And it is really hard not to think sometimes that this is being a deliberate perversion of what was going on. And it raises the bar very often to the diagnostic level when that's not required. So how the bar got higher? Well, I think these myths in outdated case law are very much to blame. Legends that get repeated without citation, without question. A failure clear to implement the standards of the new API and to understand and adhere to the standards of the Istanbul Protocol, and bizarre paradoxical expectations of what doctors can and cannot do. So I'm just going to leave you at 3 more slides. Give me my minute. In countries where asylum seekers are examined to establish evidence of torture, the reluctance to acknowledge claims of torture may be politically motivated. The Istanbul Protocol also got ahead of us with countertransference, avoidance, withdrawal, defensive indifference, anger or repugnance can arise in people doing this work and may prejudice their ability to make an objective evaluation. What are the implications for practice? One question, who is an expert? How should non-IP compliant reports, such as a Rule 35 report, be assessed? And does the disconnect between medical evidence and legal conclusions about it lead to loss of confidence in professional expertise? If there's no opposite expert and no cross-examination, does the decision maker take on these roles and then become led to make clinical judgments in a way that just would not happen in other settings? Thank you.